The IDF has struck a target in southern Gaza, preparing to launch flaming kites and balloons over the Israeli border. It's part of weekly mass demonstrations in the area that have been raging for more than 2 months now.
Despite that one incident, the scene along the Israeli-Gaza border was the quietest it's been in weeks. I-24 News correspondent Daniel Tzemach has more.
It's the 11th week now of the mass March of Return, which began on March 30th. This has to be the quietest Friday in that period in time. We spoke to a fireman here on site, acknowledging that this was the quietest Friday he has seen, as well as a regional council head of this particular region in Eshkol. Ultimately, though, the day did begin with one incendiary balloon that was found on a highway near the Israel-Gaza border. The Israeli military also targeted a cell that was preparing these incendiary balloons and kites in Gaza with warning shots, damaging a vehicle and infrastructure there. But towards the end of the day, only tens of Palestinians were demonstrating along the border. And Hamas called to send 5,000 kites, putting Israeli border communities under a siege of fiery kites. Well, until now, we have not seen that transpire. And it might seem as though the Palestinians are not heeding to the calls to protest as they have in past weeks. For now, it remains quiet on this particular Friday. Daniel Tzemach, I-24 News, Israel-Gaza border.
And we're staying in the Middle East. The Syrian army has launched a new attack on its southwestern region, killing at least 6 people. It comes after the U.S. has issued a new warning to the Syrian government against any military moves in this region within the boundaries of the de-escalation zone. The area is largely controlled by rebel groups and lies along the border with Israel.
Earlier this week, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad reiterated his commitment to take back every inch of Syria by any means necessary. Assad, who relies in part on Iranian-backed militia groups like Hezbollah, also said that Iran's presence in Syria was non-negotiable and that he's open to establishing official Iranian bases in his country.
For more, let's bring in I-24 News senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson here on set with us. Nina, so according to the State Department ultimatum, if President Bashar al-Assad makes one move in the wrong direction, could we see another U.S. bombardment in Syria?
Well, I don't think we're quite there yet, Tal. This was a stark warning, however, from the State Department. And note it was from the State Department, not the White House or the Pentagon. They said that they would use firm and appropriate action should Assad's forces launch an offensive into this area. And they're giving every indication at the moment that they're preparing to do this. This would be a very bold step for him. This is a rebel-held area. It's an internationally recognized UN-backed de-escalation zone. And this was brokered by the U.S. and Russia and Jordan. As you said, it's right on the border with Israel and on the border with Jordan. Very volatile situation.
Nina, you indicated, and I think it's probably important, that this is coming from the State Department, not from the White House and the Pentagon. What could you read into that?
I think it means that they want to exhaust every diplomatic avenue possible before they take any further steps. There was a note in this statement referring to Russia and Russia's role in particular as a lever on the Syrian regime and Russia's role at the United Nations. They hold the rotating presidency of the Security Council at the moment. So the timing is also important here. A lot of pressure on Russia to pressure the Assad regime to stand down, Michael.
And Ina, you mentioned the United Nations to another development. Just a few weeks ago, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, she called the Geneva body, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, a foolish international body for passing 5 resolutions against Israel. It was on the same day, and today we're learning that the U.S. is considering maybe withdrawing from this international body.
Yes, if they do, and I can't confirm that at this point, that would be no surprise. This is a wing of the UN. It's the Human Rights Council. It's based in Geneva. The problem for the United States and some other nations is there is a permanent agenda item, item 7, that handles Israel. Nikki Haley has been pushing for reform of the council. It does have a very useful function. It tackles Syria. It tackles human rights abuses around the world, for instance, Myanmar at the moment. But the US wants to see it reform, or they might well step back.
Nina Larson, thank you. And to further discuss, we're still here with John Stylianides, geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. John, last time the U.S. bombarded Syria, it was after a chemical weapons attack, and now we're hearing the State Department threat ultimatum to President Bashar Assad. What do you make of all this?
I think what we need to do, first of all, is look at the composition of Syrian armed forces that might move in that direction. And the problem there is that they comprise Iranian forces as well. The Israelis have made very clear that having any type of Iranian forces or Hezbollah anywhere near this area that's part of the de-escalation zone, and also looking back to the 1974 agreement between Syria and Israel to have essentially this zone that's 25 kilometers from the Israeli border, free of any type of forces, is going to be a red line for Israel, and they've made this clear also with the Russians. So we've seen talks between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Putin. We have the Israeli and Russian defense minister speaking, and the Russians themselves don't really have a long-term interest in a pronounced Iranian presence in Syria. Their interest is in having a strong man along the Mediterranean coast to make sure Russia gets to keep its 49-year leases on air and naval bases there. And to the extent that Israel and Russia have a shared interest in some type of a stable government in Damascus and denying the Iranians any type of a foothold in the country, they might be working together along these lines.
And, you know, going off of what Nina was just talking about, John, the idea that the United States is now dealing with this in as diplomatic a way as they can, is that by a choice that they felt that they had to make at this point, or is it one that they want to? Do they want to sort of recede from this as much as possible?
I don't know if it's a matter of wanting to recede. I mean, look at what the president is talking about with the potential summit with Vladimir Putin. I mean, the president continues to maintain that there are many areas of mutual interest that we can work together with the Russians on. And if we can work with Russia and Israel here against a common foe, against Iran, at least from a U.S. and Israeli perspective, where Russia has a pronounced interest in diminishing Iran's influence, there is potentially a way to work this out diplomatically. And I don't think we're looking for any reason to engage in military activity unless we feel it absolutely necessary. But I agree with Nina. This is a diplomatic issue right now for the State Department.
The State Department, by the way, their statement also referred to Russia. It said Russia is responsible to use its influence over the Syrian government to seize further military offensive. But can Assad actually stop? He just won back the middle of the country, but what about the rest of it? He said in an interview, I think with Russia Today, right, that he will not seize until he gains back all the territory.
Probably the only reason that Assad is alive today is because of Vladimir Putin. He's deeply in debt. Putin has tremendous leverage over every decision that Assad will make. How this gets taken care of, I think we'll defer to the Russians right now and let them sort out Syria and Iran and what they're doing near Golan. But I think the outreached hand to Russia is very important as part of the larger Trump strategy. Work with us to solve problems. Let's demonstrate to the world not everything has to be inimical between these two great powers.
So that's interesting that you said something pretty provocative there, that the only reason, probably, you said, that Assad is alive is because of Vladimir Putin. If that's the case, then how, you know, what are Assad's moves here? If there's any sort of, I guess, veering from what the Russian plan is for him, what can he possibly do?
It's going to be a very difficult balancing test for Assad because he not only owes his life to the Russians, but remember, it was the Iranians that convinced the Russians in the summer of 2015 to send in their air force and back up basically Iranian and Hezbollah ground forces in support of Assad when his regime was about to collapse in the spring of 2015. So how Assad is able to navigate this between Russia and Iran is going to be very, very difficult. I don't envy him one bit.
The focus that the State Department now has on southwestern Syria, do you think that it's part of President Trump looking after Israel's interests, or is it bigger than that?
I think that's a core issue here. I mean, when Prime Minister Netanyahu is able to explain to the president what are core security issues for Israel, and the U.S. can be helpful, and really here in almost a complementary role. Again, this isn't just the U.S. coming to Israel's defense. This is the Israelis and the Russians building their own bilateral relationship. And it's an important relationship for both Jerusalem and for Moscow. So I think you almost have a trilateral dimension to this. And the fact that Jordan played an important role in the de-escalation agreement as well brings the Sunni Arabs into this process. It's very interesting. Again, it's a matter of diminishing the Shia crescent that the Iranians are looking to build from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean Sea.
And do you think Netanyahu is whispering in Donald Trump's ears exactly how he wants him to play this at this point until they get farther down the road?
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is offering his recommendations as to what makes the most sense. In the end, the Trump administration, working obviously with the NSC, the Defense Department, and the State Department, will offer their best calculus on how this gets done. But Netanyahu has a lot of weight in Washington. There's no doubt about it under this administration.
And he also voiced these concerns yesterday at a Homeland Security conference yesterday, an international one in Jerusalem, where Netanyahu said that Iran is trying to break the balance in Syria, bringing in 80,000 Shiite militants into the country. Well, do you think that Netanyahu is right when he said that this might ignite another round of war, a theological, religious war?
I'd rather not go in that direction from this perch here in the United States, but I will say that I think Israel is being given more expansive room to be able to retaliate to provocative Iranian moves in Syria over the last several years. I think the Israelis felt very much constrained under the prior administration, and between President Trump's own very open pronouncements in support of Israel, and also the friendships that have been established behind the scenes between top Trump administration officials, Israeli officials, and critical Sunni Arab allies, namely Saudi Arabia here. You have a very interesting array of geopolitical forces that we've not seen in the region in years, if decades, if ever.
Is there a timetable for this? I mean, how long do they have to let this play out?
I think it's a matter of how the Russians are able to deal with the Iranian problem in Syria.
Okay. That's asked and answered. John Sitilides, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Really good stuff. Still ahead, in Yemen, the Saudi-led coalition is advancing on a key port. The UN is worried the fighting will cut off the only lifeline for people in Yemen who depend on the port to bring in food and aid.
Plus, the Taliban leader who ordered the hit on student activist Malala Yousafzai was reportedly killed in a U.S. drone attack.